All right, welcome back. And this series of lecture is going to be about your senses or your sensory system. We spent a good amount of time talking about the nervous system in general, how nerves work, how action potentials are sent, okay, the axon region, the dendrite region, etc. Now we're going to talk about what occurs for a lot of those signals or a lot of those action potentials to be sent, and what kind of stimuli must happen in order for those signals to be sent. And that really comes into play with a bunch of different sensory molecules and sensory systems that we'll spend some time talking about. So first off, why sense things? Okay, well, that connection between the internal and outside environment is obviously really important. Knowing what the temperature is, knowing what might be biting you, knowing what, how much wind's blowing, knowing if you're sitting down or standing up. All these things are based on pressure. Okay, know what you look at, what you hear, what you taste. All these things are based on not pressure, but based on sensory systems. Some are based on pressure, like whether you're standing or sitting is a lot is based on pressure. And knowing that allows for us to maintain homeostasis. Okay, if it's cold out and your outer surface of your epidermis is starting to get chilled and cold, okay, that's will send an impulse to your body to either push more blood into that region if it's um, needed, or the perception of that would be, hey, it's time to put on a coat, that kind of stuff. So we'll come back and we'll talk a lot more about how each one of these works. But there are two main categories of senses. You have the generalized senses, which might occur throughout the body, in many regions of the body, and they're going to have kind of the same response, you know, in each region. So you might have generalized senses on your arm that would react the same as generalized senses on your calf, which would react the same as generalized senses that are on the top of your head. So these just normally are associated with touch, temperature, abrasion, pressure, that kind of stuff. Then you have specialized sensories that only occur in certain regions of the body. Okay? And we often will think about senses and sensory system based on these special senses. Okay, so like vision, hearing, taste, smell, etc. And we'll come back and spend a lot of time talking about these. But the receptor itself is going to be that connection between the environment and the central nervous system. Okay, and so that connection is a nerve connection. Okay, it's not always that the nerve is directly associated with or has a receptor attached to it or is the receptor. Sometimes they're just associated with the receptor, and we'll come back and we'll talk about this. But it's really that connection between the outside world or the environment, even the internal environment, and the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so here's just a quick example. So if we're talking about the peripheral nervous system, we're talking about the outside world. We're, picking or using this needle to prick the skin of this individual. Okay, that's going to cause damage to cells in this region. When you damage cells, often they'll send out or release chemicals. These chemicals can react to the free ends of these nerves. So you have these nerves in that region. Okay, so you have a stimulus, and then a transduction. So that's going to start the signal. It's going to start this action potential. So that stimulus has to reach that threshold. Okay, if that stimuli reaches the threshold or above the threshold, then that action potential can continue. Okay, in some cases, you might need quite a bit of stimuli to get enough of a response to get over the threshold. Okay. When it happens, then transmission can occur. Transmission would then send that signal through the axon, in this case from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. Okay. And then you get interpretation in a couple of places. You can get interpretation that occurs in the spinal cord. You can get interpretation that occurs in the brain, okay, or both. Okay. After interpretation occurs, a new signal is sent for transmission. That transmission signal will then go into transduction, which will then go into a stimulus. Okay. Now, sometimes that's stimulating muscle movement. Sometimes that's stimulating an influx of blood to the region or glandular production. Okay, but it's going to stimulate some type of response. Okay. So again, recap. Stimulus first stimulates the sensory receptors. Okay, and there's lots of different types of sensory receptors. We'll cover many of them, but not all of them. Okay, that sensory or that stimulus is going to be converted, and it's converted into what we call a transduction. If the transduction is high enough to create an action potential, so it's got to be over the threshold. If it's high enough to create an action potential, then that will trigger an action potential, okay? And that would trigger a signal for the action potential to move down the axon, which we call transmission, okay, to the central nervous system. Okay. Once in the central nervous system, it will move between neurons. We talked about this in previous lectures. It'll move between the neurons, which are called interneuron connections, okay, and it'll move between them, and you'll get some type of interpretation. And we'll come back and talk about what that interpretation might look like. All right, so what are the sensory receptors? They respond typically to a specific type of stimuli. So thermoreceptors, they're responding to temperature change. Mechanical receptors are responding to mechanical things like touch or abrasion, stretching, these kind of things. Okay, so different stimuli respond to different, or you get different responses to different stimuli because you have different receptors in that region. Okay. So let's look at a few different types of receptors. First, you can have chemical receptors, which we call chemoreceptors. These are looking at different concentrations of chemicals in the region. The chemicals can be as complex as huge carbohydrates, or as simple as ions. Okay, and so this is how taste works, smell works, how we regulate with oxygen concentration in our lungs, lots of things that are related to a chemical binding to a site on a protein. Okay. Pain receptors, okay, these are associated mainly with tissue damage. Okay, so when a cell gets damaged, it gets broken up, it will release chemicals that are specific to kind of that action of destruction. And this can be due to mechanical destruction, electrical destruction, thermal destruction, okay, and that would cause the nociceptors to release or start an action potential if there's enough damage. Thermoreceptors, okay, pretty self-explanatory. Okay, they relate to temperature, both hot and cold. And we'll come back and we'll talk more about these in later lectures. Mechanoreceptors, okay, these are going to be associated with touch, tension, pressure, stretching, relaxation, these kind of things. Anything that really distorts and moves the receptor in a direction can be considered a mechanoreceptor. Photoreceptors, they're related to light, photons. Photons travel in wavelengths, and so we see vision, or our visible light spectrum is from about 300 nanometers to about 390 nanometers to about 700 nanometers, and that's what we can see. So that's how our eyes respond to just the wavelengths that we can detect in that region. And we'll come back and talk more about that. All right, so when we're talking about sensory impulses, we're talking about the tips of a neuron, or the association between a nerve cell and other cells that might be in that region. Often what we're associating with is that change in membrane potential. Remember how action potentials work. Okay, normally your nerve cells are sitting at roughly negative 70 millivolts, and if you make them more positive, all the way up to maybe negative 55 millivolts, that's threshold or so. Okay, once you get past that, you can create what's called a depolarization event, which means that a impulse or a signal can be sent across the cell. Okay, and then a repolarization event, etc. We talked about this before. Okay, so that's what a sensory impulse really is. You have some effect that's changing the environment, so it can change the internal environment of a neuron, which then can stimulate an action potential. Yeah. These can be part of a neuron. Okay, so the very first kind of example I showed you is these free-ended nerves. Okay, so the nerves are just in that region, and they can sense, pressure and pain and other things that are in that region. Or you can have a receptor that is not part of the neuron, but is in the region, and so in close contact with the neuron, you might have a specialized receptor that has many different functions. Okay, it could be temperature, it could be pressure, it could be chemical, it could be all kinds of things. At any rate, majority of the time, what's going on is you have a change in the environment in a specific region, either directly associated with a neuron or associated with cells that are then associated with a neuron. Okay, and that is going to send a signal, an action potential, that moves from the peripheral nerves, from the peripheral nervous system, okay, to the central nervous system. Okay. And when it gets into the central nervous system, it can be interpreted and a signal can be sent back. All right, so sensation. So these are just kind of how it works. The sensation is the actual awareness of a sensory event. Okay, so sensory has happened. You prick your finger with a needle. Okay, that's enough to go over the threshold, send the action potential. The action potential moves down the axon into the central nervous system. Now you have a sensation of pain. Okay? After that is the perception. Now, when it's in the brain, in the central nervous system, and it's moving between the interneurons, now these signals are being interpreted. Okay? So your brain is trying to figure out, yep, I have pain, but what's caused the pain. Okay? And after that, then you have a projection. Okay? And so part of that sensation perception is the projection. What does this sensation mean? Okay? How is it derived? What receptors, okay, are generating that sensation? Okay? And then after that, you can send back a signal to the region, hopefully, where that receptor that is sending the sensation is at. Okay, so then you can stimulate that region to move, or um, to react to whatever that sensation is. Okay, we have a bunch of special senses also, which are listed here, and they work in a similar fashion to the generalized senses, except for they normally are associated with specialized cells and specialized nerves and specialized regions of the brain. So you have that specialized sensation, specialized perception, and specialized ability to produce a response. Okay? So for the most part, we'll cover each one of these in much greater detail, but your sensory receptors are specialized cells in the region. Okay? They're going to be traveling through specialized fibers, nerve fibers. Okay? They're going to travel into special regions of the central nervous system. Okay? And then after that, you can then have a sensation. Okay? So maybe you have sweet taste, and so you're like, it tastes sweet. Okay? And then real quick, like, that signal is then generated a perception. Well, what tastes sweet? What is the material that is making that sweet taste? And in this case, you might have a combination of smell and taste, which often occurs. And you might say, well, it smells like an apple and it tastes like an apple, therefore it's probably an apple. Okay? And that's kind of how those sensory systems work. Okay? And we'll cover more on those as we progress. Okay, so adaptation can occur and does occur. So often you need a certain level of stimuli to create that action potential. Okay, we talked about this before. You can have stimuli, and if they're not intense enough or don't happen frequently enough, you'll never make that threshold, and an action potential wouldn't occur, and so you wouldn't feel the pain. You wouldn't taste the sweetness. You won't see something. Okay, but if the stimulus happens often enough, then you'll get a response. But sometimes it happens too much. You have too much of a stimuli. Okay, maybe you have unimportant material coming in. So like peripheral vision. Okay, it's really unimportant what's out to your peripheral sides in many cases. It's unimportant. You're paying attention to things that are directly in front of you. So the unimportant information, those stimuli, you're able to ignore them. Okay? And if it occurs enough over time, you can ignore or have sensory adaptation. Okay? This happens a lot in things like thermoreceptors and olfactory receptors. For example, if you're a professional cook, like a chef, and you deal with hot pans and hot ovens and stoves on a day-to-day basis, okay, your temperature receptors get less and less impulses from temperature. Okay, so maybe when you first started out, you're like, wow, that's really hot. But over time, they react to that temperature change less frequently, and therefore you become more accustomed to the hot temperatures. In fact, in some cases, it's so infrequent that an individual could pick up a pan that is extremely hot enough to cause skin damage, and they would not sense it with their temperature or their thermoreceptors. They might sense it after it already causes skin damage with their pain receptors, but the thermoreceptors wouldn't pick it up. Okay, and that's sensory adaptation, adapting to overstimuli, and making changes as you go. All right, the general senses, again, these are widespread, typically associated with skin, muscle, joints, the viscera, so your intestine lining, your blood vessels, all over in your lungs. Okay, you got three kind of groups that can be divided. The extraceptive senses. These are normally associated with touch, pressure, temperature, pain, and they occur throughout the body, all over the place. Normally associated with the body's surface, but can be many different regions. Okay? Then you have the interoceptive or the visceroceptive senses. These are occurring around the visceral organs, okay, associated with blood vessels, your intestines, stomach, okay, things that you probably aren't going to have any control over, but need to be controlled based on pressure or stretching or contracting, these kind of things. Okay? And the proprioceptive senses, these are normally associated with often what you can control. Okay, so things like skeletal muscle, your tendons, your joints, body position, okay? And again, much like the interoceptive, they might be associated with tension or stretching receptors, and so you can get some change in those and reaction to those. Okay. There are three main types of mechanoreceptors for touch and pressure, and first are kind of just free nerve endings. Okay, so these are nerves that might stretch into the epidermis layer, and we'll kind of talk and look at these a little bit more. Okay, these are the most simple. Okay, but they give you sensation of pressure and things like that, touch, like if something's brushing up against you, you can feel it, that kind of thing. And often these are associated with other things like itching. And so if you're allergic to something like cats or horses or something like that, and you get their dander, their hair follicles on you, okay, the chemistry, the chemicals in those, okay, can irritate the skin, but that skin irritation, that change in chemistry of the skin in that region, will then entice the free nerve endings to change and send signals, and then you'll feel itching or burning or lots of sensations in that region. The tactile, or what's called the Meissner's corpuscles. Okay, corpuscle just means it's like a group or a globular chunk of cells. Normally they're specialized for a certain region. In this case, the tactile or Meissner's are associated with bare skin, so regions that typically don't have hair follicles, but they react to similar things that a hair follicle would, and that is light, fine touches, textures, so like wind blowing across hairless portions of your body. You can feel the air blowing in those regions and that kind of thing. Kind of the opposite of the lamellated or the Pacinen corpuscles, which are more heavy pressure. Okay, so and they're deeper down in the body. So vibrations, heavy pressure, associated often with muscles and tendons and ligaments and these kinds of things. But both are corpuscles in the sense that they're these globular structures that are associated with the nerve. So they're not free nerve endings. The nerve is often penetrating or really close to the corpuscle in association to feel changes in the environment or react to changes in the environment. Okay, so looking at that, you have these free nerve endings. Okay, in this case, it's showing you a nerve that's originating in the dermis, but its dendrites and the free nerve portions, okay, are branching up into the epidermis and associating with the cells in that region. Okay. The corpuscles, the Meissner, okay, closer to the surface, up near the epidermis, and are often, fine, more fine movements, okay, like abrasions or a little bit of pressure that occurs there, wind sources, these kind of things that might occur in those regions. They react to that, and then deeper down in the dermis, sometimes really deep, like around the hypodermis, you'll have the Pachina corpuscles, and these are deep pressure sensors, okay, and often associated with, that was a true force, like a true pushing down on regions, true force that occurs in that region and cause a response. Okay? Sometimes associated with the response of being bruising or blood vessels being broken, because they often are associated in that region where there's a lot of blood. Okay, next time out, we're going to talk more about kind of just general sensory and how they work and where you find the different cells at.